Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, what my amendment would do is to limit the definition in the bill of adverse action. Currently, if you look at the definition of adverse action in the chapter, it is extremely broad. It states adverse action means any action that directly or indirectly adversely affects the person against whom the adverse action is taken, places the person in a worse position than the person was in before the adverse action was taken, or is likely to deter a reasonable person from acting or refusing to act. And then it includes a list of things that does not say it's exhaustive, that could be or are an adverse action. It's extremely broad. Later on in this bill, there is a creation of a private right of action. And so if we are creating a private right of action, we need to know what we're creating it about. So my amendment creates an adverse action, defines it only as affecting a license for a child welfare services provider. So under my amendment, an adverse action means with respect to a child welfare services provider only, any action that materially alters the provider's license under a state program, including taking an enforcement action against a license holder, refusing to issue a license, refusing to renew a license, revoking a license, or suspending a license. And I want the membership to know that this bill is very much in the spirit of a bill that was passed earlier this year in Alabama. However, the Alabama law only affects licensing and says that if a provider that does not take government money chooses to discriminate for religious beliefs, the licensing cannot be revoked. This amendment would limit.
Representative Rodriguez, for what purpose?
Will the lady yield?
Will the gentlelady yield?
I will.
She yields.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative Hinojosa, I want to make sure I understand the distinction that you're trying to make with this amendment. If your amendment passes, who will then this bill apply to?
If my amendment passes, this bill applies to welfare services providers who have licenses.
Okay. What's the danger, do you think, in allowing religious refusal to agencies that work with children who receive state money?
Well, there's a few. For one, let me quote a very wise former governor of the state of Texas who said, "Life is not fair, but government absolutely must be."
So
when we're dealing with state money, we must ensure that state money is applied equally to all, that there is an equal protection that is enforced, because when we're using state money, we're asking this private entity to stand in the shoes of the state.
So I think you may not know this, but one of the main discussions that Representative Frank and others had about this bill was the fact that we are talking about state money here. And when we're talking about state money, we need to be careful when it comes to discrimination. We need to be careful about discrimination all the time, but when you talk about state money, that means all their taxpayers' money. That means that the state is condoning or is supporting certain actions, right, when you have state money involved. Do you agree with that?
Well, when a private entity, let's say, for example, the Catholic Church, I'm Catholic, you're Catholic, let's say, give the example of the Catholic Church. When the Catholic Church takes government money to provide a service, it takes off the hat, the faith, the hat of being a place of faith, and it puts on the hat of the state.
Of the state.
And so at that point, it needs to act in a way that does not discriminate.
In many ways, they're agents of the state at that point.
That's it.
So they need to act accordingly. So we're just trying to make sure, I think you, I, and many others that have amendments is trying to make sure as much as possible, but considering this bill, which is difficult to do, that we're not discriminating when it comes to placing these kids. Is that correct?
That's absolutely right.
Thank you, Representative.
Yes, my pleasure. So again, members, this amendment limits for two reasons. One is because when we're dealing with state money, we should not be allowing for discrimination, tolerating discrimination, and that's what this bill allows for currently in its current form. Make no mistake, it allows for discrimination against a Jewish family, placement in a Jewish family, discrimination against parents who have been previously divorced. Those things could be sincerely held religious beliefs. We don't discriminate. The state does not discriminate. Government does not discriminate based on religion. And when an entity takes state money to do the state's job, it should not discriminate either.
Representative Ortega, for what purpose?
Will you yield for some questions,
Will the
Representative?
gentlelady yield?
Yes.
She yields.
What is your biggest fear with this bill?
My fear is that children will be hurt. My fear is that we will be, there are two issues, right? For this amendment, there are actually three issues. One is that adverse action is very broad. The second is that we need to have equal protection under the law. But the third is freedom of religion. And the state should not be endorsing any religion or imposing any religion on anyone. And when the state chooses, when a private entity chooses for the state where a child goes, it is imposing religion on the child. It is imposing religion, a certain religion, whether it's a certain denomination of Christianity, whatever that may be, is imposing that upon a child, upon a family.
Do you think that this bill would impact our state's reputation if it passes?
Well, absolutely. I think it would. This bill allows for the state to discriminate, and I don't think that can ever be viewed as a good thing.
Are we discriminating more than Arizona if this bill passes?
Yes, because the Arizona, I'll say Alabama, specifically Alabama. We are, the reference I made to earlier was Alabama, because Alabama's statute only allows for licensing to remain intact if a private entity that does not receive state money discriminates based on religious belief.
I think you have a good amendment and it should pass. Thank you.
Mr. Speaker, members, I move adoption.
Members, Representative Hinojosa sends up an amendment. Anybody wishing to speak on for or against that amendment? If not, the question occurs. Passes the amendment. The clerk will ring the bell. So Representative Frank voting nay, Representative Burkett voting nay, Parker voting nay, Collier voting aye, Swanson voting nay. Have all members voted? Members, use the device at your desk. There being 54 ayes and 91 nays, the amendment fails.